Hi ladies, this is your test review podcast for Chapter 11, Late Antiquity, Chapter 12, The Art of Byzantium, and Chapter 13, The Art of Islam. So I skipped over Chapter 11 because I don't have a ton of time. I will tell you that I'm going to put a sprinkling of questions from Chapter 11, and what you should be focusing on in that chapter are the College Board required works, which are Santa Sabina, that early Christian basilica that we studied, the Catacomb of Priscilla, which we also discussed in class, and Rebecca and Eliza at the well, and Jacob wrestling the angel from the Vienna Genesis, okay, that illuminated manuscript that we looked at in class. So read about that, review your notes about that, and be prepared to answer a couple of questions about those artworks. So I'm going to go quickly through Chapter 12 and spend a little bit more time in Chapter 13 since we didn't get to the end of that PowerPoint. Here I have listed for you the different periods and dates for the Byzantine Empire. Remember that it is one of the longest artistic periods spanning over 1,000 years. So it's a long period of time. And basically what happens is we see a lot more religious imagery appear. We see a lot of iconography. We see a lot of images of Jesus, of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, the apostles, things like that are depicted in art a lot, except for during this period of iconoclasm. Okay, so during iconoclasm, all religious imagery is covered up or destroyed because it was seen as disrespectful. It was seen as idolatry. The other things that you should be thinking about, you should have kind of in the back of your mind as we go through this PowerPoint, are just the general stylistic characteristics of Byzantine art. So what do the figures look like? What colors were used? What medium was favored? All right, and these were all things, again, we discussed in class, so please think about that. And then also the architecture is really important. So we see a lot of Christian churches being erected during this time. So think about where were they located, who commissioned them, what did the outside of the churches look like, what did the inside of the churches look like, what was the plan. Remember that we're in the East, Rome in the East, we're in the Roman Empire in the eastern half, and they, remember, favored the centrally planned Christian church. So consider that as well, but think about how does that church plan and design and decoration, how does that change from the early Byzantine to the middle Byzantine to the late Byzantine period. Think about those transitions that occur. In addition to discussing the transition from early through late Byzantine architecture, I want you to also be comfortable with knowing all of the church parts and also knowing all of the mosque parts. I gave you a diagram of a typical Christian church plan with all of the parts labeled. I also gave you a diagram of a typical mosque plan. So you should be prepared to answer questions about those parts. You should also be prepared to label a blank plan of each. So as we're looking at the interior of this church, hopefully you're recognizing this as Santa Sabina from Rome. This is an early Christian basilica, so it has the typical flat timber roof. It has unfluted Corinthian, or I'm sorry, they're fluted Corinthian columns. We are looking in through the nave, okay, also known sometimes as the naos. We are looking also at the apse, okay, so anytime you see a half dome or a dome that's sort of jutting out from the exterior of the building, that's always called an apse, okay? Right above the apse or right in front of the apse is the altar, and this space would have been reserved for clergy only. Flanking the nave are the aisles, sometimes these are called galleries. Okay, the row of windows at the top here, this is called the clerestory, and the entrance to the church remember, you would have entered the church on the short side, not the long side, as you would have in Roman times. The entrance to the church is called the narthex, and the front of the church, the exterior front of the church, is called the facade. We also talked a fair amount about squinches and pendentives, so you should be familiar with those two architectural elements, know how they're used, where they're used, and being able to draw a simple diagram of them would be helpful as well. These three structures you should be very familiar with. We talked about Hagia Sophia and the Dome of the Rock. I'm not sure we talked too much about the Mosque of Selim, but I will talk about it when I get to my next PowerPoint. But these are, again, these are buildings that you should be very familiar with and you should be comfortable talking about. They are all required images by the College Board. We spend a lot of time talking about Hagia Sophia. You should know how the dome is supported, what the inside looks like, what the outside looks like. Think about the function of the building and how that's changed over time. It was also a really influential building. It influenced lots of mosques. I mean, look at the similarities here between Hagia Sophia and then the Mosque of Selim II, which was built hundreds of years later. There's clearly a lot of influence from Hagia Sophia here. All right, so that's also another important thing you need to remember. Or kind of heads up slide for your essay question. I had hinted about this earlier. You should be really comfortable talking about early Byzantine, Middle Byzantine, late Byzantine architectural features, and you should be able to list and discuss specific examples that illustrate each period and how it's changed throughout time. So you could use these examples. You can use any other examples in this PowerPoint, but definitely have an outline ready and specific examples ready to go. You also want to review this conclusion and key points. These are important ideas that you should have grasped from this chapter. And then finally, this little summary of the Byzantine stylistic characteristics is helpful as well. You should be familiar with this too. Moving on to chapter 13, Islamic art. I again want you to focus on the College Board required works and any other work that we spent time talking about in class or that I talk about in this podcast is what you really want to focus on. Think about all the terms we learned. There were a lot of terms. I know it's rough, but unfortunately you do need to know them. You need to know the parts of the mosque. I already said that. You should also know, the 5 pillars of Islam and how did that relate to their architecture and their art? All right, you should know defining characteristics of Islamic art and architecture. There were no figurative or zoomorphic images allowed. They used lots of bright colors, especially blue and green, lots of tile design, lots of geometric patterns. And remember, I talked about why they were so interested in geometry, so think about that as well. In class with this picture of this Macarnas dome from the Hall of the Two Sisters at Alhambra in Spain, and I really love this image. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I'd love to see it in person. And this is a required image from the College Board, so it's something you should be familiar with. This is an exterior view of Alhambra, so you can see the entire complex. It's actually very large. Okay, so all of these green areas are outdoor courtyards. So, this would have served many purposes. As we talked about, mosques were not just for religious purposes. They had schools, they had libraries, they had hospices, all sorts of different functions, and this was no different. So, what else did I want to say about this complex? Be familiar with the term Macarnas. This was all stucco, which is a very soft plaster-like material that could easily be molded and carved, which is why it has such an interesting form. It almost makes the dome sort of dissolve. It sort of looks like one fluid space, okay? And the interiors of these mosques had a very similar function to the Christian churches that we looked at in the last chapter. When you entered the mosque, you were supposed to feel as though you were in a very magical, ethereal place. It was supposed to emulate the kingdom of heaven. It was supposed to emulate paradise. So that was one of the functions of these structures. The other function of these structures was to illustrate the power and authority and the wealth of the emperors and the sultans that commissioned them. So you remember, we're always thinking about form, function, content, context. So those are also ideas that you want to think about as we're analyzing these artworks. The Mosque of Selim II, who was a famous ruler in the 16th century. The architect is Sinan, who you absolutely need to know. He's one of the most famous architects of all time. And this was one of his crowning achievements. It's obviously influenced by Hagia Sophia. It has a very similar plan, very similar shape. However, it is larger than Hagia Sophia. The minarets are taller as well, but they are still that same slender pencil-like shape. And one crowning achievement of this mosque was the huge mosaic-covered dome. So here you have a view looking upward at the dome. So the dome is set atop a square base, which is set atop an octagonal-shaped structure. Okay, so it's a dome on top of a square on top of an octagon. But when you're looking up at it from the inside, it again looks very fluid. It doesn't look separated at all, and that could be because of the extensive amount of mosaic that's covering the interior of the dome. But it was very large, and look at all of the windows piercing the dome. Okay, remind you of anything? Should remind you of Hagia Sophia, that has that same thin windows, making the dome almost look heavenly, look like it's floating. And what characteristics here look typical Islamic characteristics? You should be thinking about the color, the abstract patterns, the repeating cream and red coloring. Where else did we see that? But those are all very characteristics of Islamic art and architecture that you should be familiar with. Required mosque from the College Board. They actually picked quite a few, which I was surprised by. So this is one of them that you should be familiar with. It's the Great Mosque at Isfahan in Iran, done in roughly the 11th through 17th century. So this is one of those mosques that was built in the 11th century but had additions made to it throughout time, so it becomes much more large and elaborate. It was commissioned by Sultan Malik Shah. His name is right here, in the 11th century. It's very, very large, and it's famous for its winter prayer hall right here, that has these characteristic pointed arches and just, again, covered with colorful mosaics. Very, very beautiful. And my favorite image, this is actually a really famous image that appears on AP tests all the time, from this mosque, is this mihrab. So this gives you a good view of what a mihrab would have looked like. Mihrab is a recessed area or niche in a Qibla wall. So this is the Qibla wall that would have faced Mecca. So what sort of patterns do you see? What sort of vocabulary terms can you identify that are exhibited here? What colors do you see? Is there any writing there? So just take a minute to observe this, and you should be seeing all of these vocabulary terms that we learned: calligraphy, arabesques, geometric patterns, mosaic, okay, is all here. So you should be familiar with this as well. And the other cool thing about this is that it is in the Met in New York, so if you ever want to go see it in person, it's not that far away. So I only have about a minute left, girls, so I don't have enough time to talk about this basin. So I do want you to read about it in your textbook and be familiar with it, because it is a College Board required work, and it's unique because it contains zoomorphic images, which is very rare in Islamic art. So read about that, and then also take the time to go through my key points slide. These are very important, and then I give you a little list of things that you should be studying for your tests. I do want you to click on this link and listen to, this is another AP Art History teacher. She's, I think, from Oregon or Utah, and she is excellent, and she does podcasts as well. So every now and then I will recommend that you listen to one of her podcasts. And she has some excellent ones on Islamic art. So take the time to do that. Play the Jeopardies, review your notes, and I will see you tomorrow. So good luck studying.